April 12, 1945, near the Ruhr Pocket, 06:42 a.m. The fog was thick, cold, heavy. It crawled over the ruined fields like a living thing, muffling sound and swallowing shape. German tank engines rumbled softly beneath it, a column of Panzer foes moving east through the skeletal remains of a bombed-out village. Above the steel hulls, blackened chimneys stabbed into the gray sky like broken teeth. Birds were gone. Civilians were gone. Only machines remained, and men too tired to fear couldn't see what they... The commander of the lead Panzer adjusted his goggles and narrowed his eyes. Something felt wrong. His gut twisted, not from cold or hunger, but from silence. The kind of silence that only comes before something you don't understand. They were on schedule. No enemy scouts had been spotted. Intelligence said the Americans were still regrouping on the other side of the ridge. So why did the air feel so heavy? Why did his gunner grip the handle a little tighter? Then it came. A single shot, muffled, distant, but deadly precise. It tore through the first Panzer like a hot knife through wax. No warning, no muzzle flash, just a punch of smoke and steel. 1 second the tank was rolling. The next, it was burning. The second shell came 4 seconds later. Not aimed at the next tank in line. Aimed at the side gunner's vehicle, halfway down the column. It hit just behind the turret. A perfect angle. 2 men inside never had time to scream. That second shot shattered not just metal, but the illusion of control. Orders turned to shouting. Radios cracked with static. The formation broke. Panic rippled down the line like electricity. Every turret turned in a different direction, but there was no target, no sound, no movement in the fog. Only the quiet breathing of death. They weren't just being attacked, they were being hunted, and worse still, they were being predicted. It wasn't until much later that the survivors would admit what they had all thought in that moment. The shots hadn't just come from nowhere. They had come from places that made no sense, from angles no enemy should have known. The Shermans didn't just ambush them, they anticipated them, as if someone had read their orders before they were written. To the German crews, it felt like magic, like some dark American trick. But it wasn't magic. It was something far more terrifying. It was calculation. By the spring of 1945, the Wehrmacht had bled itself dry on the Eastern Front. What remained on the Western Front was stubborn, proud, and running on fumes. But even then, German tankers clung to one last illusion, that in a fair fight, armor versus armor, the Panzer was king. It had thicker steel, a better gun, a longer reach. The Tiger was their hammer, the Panther their scalpel. They had faced Shermans before and laughed, lightly armored, overheated, vulnerable to even a glancing blow. They called them milk cartons with engines, disposable. But that morning, something had changed. German crews didn't know was that the Shermans they now faced weren't just tanks. They were nodes in a network, a moving web of coordination, strategy, and radio chatter. They didn't fire blindly. They waited, listened, responded. And when they struck, it was never alone. One German commander, captured days later, described it like this: "We entered the town believing we had surprise, but it was us who were seen. Every corner we turned, they were already facing us, like ghosts who knew our route." That line stuck because it wasn't just one man's impression. It became a whisper that spread through the Panzer divisions, a kind of battlefield paranoia. The Americans weren't lucky. They weren't reckless. They were precise. And the fear of precision runs deeper than any gunshot. For the German tank crews, it was a nightmare they couldn't explain. Not in reports, not in letters home. It wasn't about one battle or one ambush. It was a feeling, a creeping sense that the enemy knew too much, moved too fast, reacted too perfectly. They began to hesitate. Veteran officers started changing their routes at the last minute. Some turned off radios. Others refused to move without infantry support. But nothing worked. Every time they pushed forward, it was like the Shermans were already waiting. And perhaps the most haunting part wasn't the destruction. It was the silence after. How, once the shelling ended, the battlefield remained still. Not a single engine. No calls for help. Just the sound of crackling fire and the quiet hum of American logistics. As if the Shermans had already moved on. As if they had never been there at all. That kind of fear doesn't come from bombs. It comes from intelligence. The Americans weren't fighting the war with stronger tanks. They were fighting it with smarter systems, radio coordination, aerial reconnaissance, maps updated by the hour. They didn't need better guns. They needed to know where to point them first, and in that, they were always faster. What the Germans felt that morning was the sound of the future, a new kind of warfare, one not based on individual skill or brute strength, but on information, on prediction, on connectivity. The fog no longer protected them. It only hid the trap. It was a war that would no longer be won by armor alone. And by the time the fog cleared, the tanks that had once ruled the battlefield were already smoke on the horizon. If you're fascinated by hidden moments like this one that rewrote the rules of warfare, share your thoughts below and make sure to follow the channel. Your comment might just be the start of the next forgotten tale. In the early years of the war, the German tank crews had good reason to laugh. They called it the Ronson. Lights up the first time, just like the lighter. A cruel joke whispered across radios, scribbled on chalkboards beside kill tallies. The M4 Sherman, they believed, was little more than a mobile coffin. Too tall, too lightly armored, and often carrying ammunition that turned the whole tank into a fireball with just one hit. Many Wehrmacht commanders, especially those hardened on the Eastern Front, saw the Sherman as a symbol of American arrogance, a mass-produced machine for a nation that thought quantity could replace quality. They weren't entirely wrong. The early Shermans were vulnerable. Their high profile made them easy targets. Their armor could be pierced by most German anti-tank weapons, including the infamous Panzer used by infantry, and their 75mm gun struggled to penetrate the front armor of Panthers or Tigers unless the range was extremely close or the angle perfect. German aces, who had earned their stripes in the brutal battles of Kursk or the steppes of Ukraine, scoffed at these machines. Compared to the sleek lines of the Panther or the hulking menace of the Tiger, the Sherman looked like an afterthought, more like a delivery truck than a weapon of war. They believed it was a sign of desperation, a tank built for a factory floor, not for the battlefield. But they had misunderstood something fundamental. The Sherman wasn't designed to be the best tank. It was designed to be enough to cross the Atlantic in vast numbers, enough to be maintained by mechanics with basic training, enough to be driven by soldiers fresh out of Kansas or Brooklyn or Detroit. It was not an apex predator. It was a working part of a bigger machine. That machine was the American war effort, a system of mass, production, logistics, and adaptability that no other nation could match. The Sherman was never meant to fight alone. It was never intended to win tank duels in isolation. And once it began operating the way it was meant to, supported by infantry, artillery, air power, and intelligence, it became something far more dangerous than the Germans had anticipated. The moment of realization didn't come with a single battle. It came in whispers, from platoons that were ambushed by Shermans emerging from unexpected directions, from outposts that were destroyed after spotting a single Sherman scout, only to be shelled minutes later by air support called in through a radio link, from German officers who began to note, with growing unease, that every time they thought they had cornered these American tanks, they found themselves walking into a trap. Even among the elite German tank crews, the tone began to shift. One veteran, interviewed after the war, admitted that the early confidence had been a mistake. We saw them as weak, but they always came back, and there were always more. We would kill 5, and 10 would return. They did not fight like us, but they did not need to. It wasn't just the numbers that wore the Germans down. It was the relentlessness. The Shermans never advanced recklessly. They didn't chase glory. They moved methodically, clearing territory like clockwork. Supported by engineers, medics, reconnaissance teams, and mobile repair crews, they were never far from reinforcement. If one was knocked out, it was recovered or replaced. If a crewman was wounded, a medic was already on the way. The German crews were used to fighting in isolation, relying on experience, intuition, and the raw power of their tanks. The American tankers, by contrast, operated inside a larger doctrine. They weren't individuals trying to outgun the enemy. They were pieces on a board, all connected. And slowly, the German tankers began to feel that they were playing the wrong game. One of the most overlooked features of the Sherman was its simplicity. It was easy to produce, easy to fix, and easy to upgrade. As the war progressed, new variants began to appear. The Sherman Firefly, armed with the British 17-pounder, could destroy a Tiger at long range. The jumbo Sherman had extra armor to withstand frontal hits. And field modifications, extra sandbags, logs, concrete plates, gave crews a way to adapt based on the terrain and threats they faced. This flexibility created a battlefield presence that constantly evolved. A tank that looked like a standard M4 might suddenly survive a shot that should have destroyed it. Another might fire a shell that punched clean through the side of a Panther. To the Germans, it began to seem as if the Shermans were changing faster than they could track. One officer reportedly told his unit, "Do not assume you know what the Sherman can do. Every time we meet them, they bring something new." And that, more than anything, shook their confidence. Because by 1944 and 1945, the Germans were no longer facing just tanks. They were facing a doctrine, an entire way of thinking about warfare that was designed to overwhelm, not just defeat. It didn't matter that a Panther could kill a Sherman in a one-on-one fight. That wasn't the fight the Americans were bringing. They would send 5 Shermans for every one Panther, and they had the fuel, the ammunition, and the spare parts to do it again tomorrow. And the day after that, it became a psychological war. The German tankers knew they could win a battle, but they also knew it wouldn't matter. The next day, the Shermans would be back. The map would be redrawn. The fuel depot would be gone. The bridge would be blown. The air would be filled with the buzz of American aircraft. The irony was bitter. The Germans had focused so much on creating the perfect tank that they forgot to build the perfect war. The Americans, with all their mechanical imperfections, had done just that. What started as laughter turned to frustration, then to silence. If you've ever underestimated something only to find out it was far more powerful than it appeared, share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you see the Sherman in a new light, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the forgotten stories that history tried to bury. There was a secret weapon inside every Sherman tank. You couldn't see it. It didn't fire shells or crush barbed wire under its tracks. It weighed almost nothing. But once it was turned on, the entire battlefield changed. It was the radio. Not every German tank had one. In fact, during the early years of the war, most German tanks only had a single transmitter per platoon. The rest listened. And if that lead tank was destroyed or disabled, the rest were left guessing. Communication depended on hand signals, colored flags, or prearranged maneuvers, effective in theory, disastrous in chaos. When the fog rolled in, or the shells started falling, those systems collapsed. Confusion followed. The Americans saw this weakness and built their doctrine around it. Every Sherman tank had a radio, not just to receive, but to transmit. That one change turned a group of tanks into a coordinated swarm. A platoon of Shermans didn't act like 5 machines. It acted like one thinking creature. If one tank spotted enemy armor, the others knew instantly. If one tank took fire, the others flanked while artillery support was already being requested. The crew didn't have to guess. They knew, and that made all the difference. It wasn't flashy. It didn't roar like a Tiger's 88mm cannon or look imposing like a Panther's sloped armor, but it was faster, smarter, and deadly. The Shermans didn't just see better. They shared what they saw. Imagine a battlefield like a chessboard. German tanks operated like individual pieces, each responding on its own. American tanks were part of a network, and that network included not just other tanks, but infantry units, air observers, engineers, and reconnaissance patrols. The Sherman was rarely alone, and when it appeared to be, it was likely bait for something much larger. German commanders began noticing strange patterns. Patrols would be spotted, then disappear. Moments later, artillery would fall exactly where those patrols had been. Tank formations would change direction, and American forces would already be repositioning. It was as if the enemy had eyes in the trees, in the clouds, sometimes even in their own ranks. And in a way, they did. The United States had mastered battlefield communication. Reconnaissance aircraft like the Piper Cub would fly low and slow above enemy lines, observing troop movement in real time. They relayed what they saw directly to artillery batteries and tank columns via radio. Ground forces responded instantly. What took hours for the Germans to process took minutes for the Americans. The impact was devastating. In one documented case during the Ichioki Normandy campaign, a single American recon plane identified a German armored column attempting to move through a narrow forest road. Within 15 minutes, a Sherman battalion had repositioned. Air support was called. The road was bombed. The tanks never made it to the front line. The Germans didn't understand how it had happened so fast. There was no visual contact, no intercepted order, just sudden destruction. It felt like they were fighting a force that moved at the speed of thought, and that wasn't far from the truth. Inside each Sherman, the radio was more than just a piece of equipment. It was an extension of the soldiers' awareness. Crews could speak to each other across the battlefield, warn of ambushes, share target coordinates, even offer covering fire without having line of sight. In night battles or low visibility conditions, this gave American crews near telepathic coordination. Meanwhile, German crews were often left to rely on instinct and gut feeling. One German tanker described the experience in his memoirs. "We moved into the village expecting resistance. We saw a few Shermans. They pulled back. We pursued. That was our mistake. They had called in artillery. We never saw them again. But the village burned for hours." These moments were no longer rare. They became patterns, predictable patterns. One Sherman spotted, 2 or 3 nearby. Minutes later, indirect fire or aircraft overhead. Sometimes, infantry would arrive from a flank you thought was secure. It was a rhythm, a deadly rhythm that American forces followed with terrifying efficiency. The radio was the heartbeat of that rhythm, and it didn't just help the Americans coordinate attacks. It helped them survive. Crews could call for medical assistance, for engineers to repair damaged tracks, for resupply of ammunition. German tanks, in contrast, were often left stranded after taking damage. A mechanical failure could mean abandonment. A hit to the radio operator could leave a crew completely isolated. The difference was psychological, too. American tankers felt connected, not just to each other, but to a machine behind them. A system that extended from the front lines back to the factories. They knew someone was listening. That help could be called. That their actions were part of something bigger. German crews often felt alone, brave, skilled, but increasingly aware that their fight was becoming hopeless. They weren't just being outproduced. They were being outmaneuvered, outthought, outcommunicated. And nowhere was this more obvious than in large-scale maneuvers. During Operation Cobra in July 1944, American forces used radio coordination on a massive scale to break out of the Bocage country in Normandy. Sherman columns synchronized with airstrikes, artillery barrages, and infantry movements across dozens of square kilometers. The German lines, already thinned and overextended, collapsed. Survivors reported feeling like they had been struck by a storm. One that knew exactly where they were and when to hit. This wasn't luck. It was data, shared in real time, across a battlefield that no longer belonged to the side with the biggest gun, but to the side with the best information. And yet, most German commanders continued to believe they were losing to numbers. They failed to see the doctrine behind the machines. They saw the Shermans as crude, expendable. They didn't notice the invisible threads that connected them. Threads made of sound waves, code, words, frequencies. While the German Panzers relied on strength, the Americans relied on speed. Not of movement, but of knowledge. One traveled by steel, the other traveled by signal. That difference, over time, became a chasm. And into that chasm, the German armored doctrine would fall. History is full of visible weapons, tanks, planes, guns. But sometimes the most decisive advantage is the one you can't see. If you found this insight surprising, or it changed the way you think about modern warfare, leave a comment below and share your perspective. And if you're enjoying these hidden layers of World War II, go ahead and subscribe. There are many more truths beneath the surface. January 18th, 1945. Somewhere in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the trees stood silent under a thick layer of snow, their branches weighed down by days of relentless winter. Every footstep crunched. Every breath left a trail in the air. The war here was slower, colder, and more dangerous than ever before. The Battle of the Bulge had dragged on for weeks, and the German forces were desperate for one last push. They believed they had found a soft spot, a narrow road cutting through dense forest, leading to a recently occupied village by American forces. On paper, it was the perfect place for an ambush. The column moved cautiously. Leading the charge were Panzer IVs, followed by supporting half-tracks and infantry. The plan was simple. Hit the village fast, dislodge the Americans, push through the opening, reconnect with the collapsing front. But the forest hid more than snow. The lead tank rolled forward, its turrets scanning the tree line. The village was just beyond the hill. No resistance so far. Quiet, too quiet. That thought passed quickly, buried under routine orders and mechanical noise. Then it happened. The first shell struck the lead panzer just below the turret ring. Not from the village ahead, from the left, deep in the forest. A precise shot, angled to strike where the armor was weakest. The tank erupted in smoke and flame. The column halted. Seconds later, the second shell came from the right, punching through a half-track and spraying metal fragments across the snow. Chaos erupted. Officers screamed orders into radios. Infantry dismounted and scrambled for cover. Turrets turned wildly, trying to spot an enemy they could not see. The forest offered no answer. No muzzle flashes, no engine roars, only the distant echo of movement. And then, more shots. Time from the rear. The tail vehicle exploded, trapping the remaining tanks in a narrow corridor. They had walked into the jaws of a machine, hidden beneath camouflage nets, behind fallen trees, and inside shallow dugouts. American Shermans had been waiting. They had been positioned for hours, guided by reconnaissance planes and forward observers. Their engines had been preheated, guns loaded, ranges calculated. They didn't fire in panic. They fired with precision. This was not an ambush of chance. It was a trap of design. The Shermans worked in pairs. One would fire, then relocate. The other would cover. They moved like hunters. The Germans never knew how many they faced. Was it a platoon? A full company? The fog and the trees gave no answers. And then came the artillery. American forward observers, already in position, had marked the road the night before. The moment the first shots were fired, coordinates were relayed back. Within minutes, 105mm shells rained down. Snow exploded into steam. Trees snapped like matchsticks. The forest turned into a furnace. Few Germans made it out. One of them, a wounded lieutenant, would later write in his journal, "It was as if they had built the battlefield around us. Every turn we took was the wrong one. Every direction led to fire. I never saw a single tank, but I heard them, always moving, always knowing." That moment, etched in the memory of survivors, was more than just a loss. It was a revelation. The Americans turned the terrain into a weapon. Where the Germans saw opportunity, the Americans saw a blueprint. They didn't just hold the village, they controlled the forest. Every path, every ridge, every frozen trail had been mapped, watched, measured. The Shermans were never in the village. They were outside it, around it, above it. The village itself was a decoy. This level of planning was made possible not by superior firepower, but by superior coordination. Days before the German advance, scouts had detected movement. Intelligence reports were cross-checked with aerial photographs. Local units were alerted. Engineers reinforced the only bridge that mattered and mined the rest. The Shermans were deployed not to hold the line, but to collapse it on top of the enemy. There was no charge, no dramatic counterattack, just cold, mechanical destruction. It was war stripped of drama, clinical, relentless, and that, in many ways, made it more terrifying. The German tank crews had been trained for combat. They knew the clang of steel, the recoil of a cannon, the roar of a diesel engine. But nothing in their training prepared them for this kind of enemy. One they could not see, one that never stopped moving, one that struck only when it knew it could win. The psychological toll was immense. In the days that followed, nearby German units refused to move through that forest without heavy infantry support. Some requested Luftwaffe reconnaissance before advancing. Others simply rerouted altogether. The loss of a few tanks had shaken the confidence of entire companies, because it was not just about the tanks. It was about the feeling that the Americans were always watching, always ready, that the forest itself had betrayed them. What once felt like home terrain had become enemy territory. And this was happening all over Europe. American units began to use terrain as a multiplier. Hills became artillery platforms, forests became trap corridors, ruins became kill zones. Wherever German forces thought they had the upper hand, American planning flipped the balance. They weren't just reacting to enemy movements, they were designing them. They baited with open space, lured with abandoned equipment, allowed minor advances only to close the door behind them. And the Shermans were always at the center of this machine. They didn't need to be faster or stronger. They needed to be placed exactly where the enemy would walk, and that made them unstoppable. In modern warfare, we often think about technology as the deciding factor. Bigger bombs, faster jets, stronger armor. But sometimes, victory comes from understanding your enemies so well that you can shape their decisions without them knowing. If this story gave you a new appreciation for what coordination and terrain mastery can achieve in battle, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. And if these untold strategies of World War II fascinate you as much as they do us, subscribe now and help us keep these forgotten truths alive. It was the kind of strategy that made old generals uncomfortable. Sacrifice one tank to save 5. Send one crew into danger so the rest could encircle the target. Put something vulnerable where the enemy would see it, and let them come. To many, it felt like a gamble. But to the American tank commanders of 1944 and 1945, it was cold logic. The Sherman had never been built for brute force, so it learned to lure instead. Again and again, a single Sherman would roll just into view, alone on a country road or half visible at the edge of a tree line. Its turret moved slowly, sometimes deliberately exposed, as if unaware of the threat nearby. To a German tank crew staring through optics, it was an invitation. Fire. Destroy it. Take the kill. But the moment they opened fire, they lost the element of surprise. And that was when the real attack began. A pair of Shermans hidden on a ridgeline would respond within seconds. Infantry with anti-tank weapons would close in from the flanks. Sometimes it was artillery. Sometimes it was aircraft. Always, it was more than just that one lonely tank. That tank was bait. The crew knew it, and still, they volunteered. This tactic came to be known informally as hit and call. The first tank made contact, then called in the hammer. That hammer could be anything the Americans had available. Shermans with high-velocity guns, tank destroyers, T-47 Thunderbolts circling overhead with armor-piercing rockets. The German response was always the same: fusion, frustration, then fear, because the tank they thought they had cornered was never alone. This approach required discipline and trust. Crews had to resist the urge to fire first. They had to endure being fired upon, trusting their armor and positioning long enough to let the trap snap shut. It wasn't heroism, it was math. Every German tank that revealed its position was one step closer to being erased, and the Americans had the numbers to play that game all day. One of the most effective variations of this tactic involved the use of the Jumbo Sherman. Officially designated as the M4A3E2, it was a heavily armored variant developed specifically for leading assaults. Its extra frontal plating could absorb hits that would destroy a regular Sherman. In a standard engagement, the Jumbo would drive out first, slowly and visibly. German gunners, trained to fire at center mass, would strike its thick armor to little effect. Then, as the German crew scrambled to reload, the lighter Shermans would emerge and flank. It was not glamorous, it was not flashy, but it worked. Another terrifying variant was the Sherman Firefly. Armed with the British 17-pounder gun, it had the power to kill even a tiger from 1,500 meters away. But the Firefly was rarely the first to fire. Its job was to hide, to wait, to strike once the enemy was engaged with something else, once the German turret had turned, once the enemy believed it was in control. Then the Maitiud Firefly would fire once, only once, because that was all it needed. The Firefly's reputation grew quickly. German tank crews began to fear the long barrel silhouette. Some even claimed they could spot one from a distance and would refuse to engage. Others began targeting fireflies first, no matter what else was on the field. This forced firefly crews to camouflage their barrels, wrapping them with rags or painting them to look shorter. Some even parked behind bushes to conceal their height. What mattered was being overlooked just long enough. These battlefield illusions became part of the doctrine. In one engagement near St. Lo, a platoon of Shermans faked a retreat through a narrow road. The Germans advanced, confident, but they were walking into a loop. The retreating tanks had repositioned. A firefly waited behind a hedgerow. The first shot disabled the lead Panther. The next took out the last. The rest were boxed in. Artillery followed. Then the infantry. The trap closed like clockwork. This wasn't just smart maneuvering. It was a different kind of warfare. A war where victory did not come from meeting strength with strength, but from turning the enemy's aggression into a weakness. The Germans had built tanks to dominate the field. The Americans had turned the field into a weapon. They learned that the battlefield was more than ground to be taken. It was a space to be controlled, sculpted, used. Every hill was a vantage point. Every road was a potential funnel. Every tree line could be a wall or a hiding place. And every Sherman, no matter how vulnerable it looked, could be the opening note in a very calculated symphony. Some American commanders even began to favor using damaged tanks as decoys. A burned-out Sherman placed visibly in a field often suggested weakness. German patrols would move toward it, expecting survivors or salvage. What they did not expect was a hidden observation team waiting to relay their position. The battlefield was no longer about who had the better machine. It was about who understood how the enemy thought. And the Americans had started to understand it very well. Even the crews themselves noticed this shift. Early in the war, many tankers felt exposed, under-equipped. They watched as German rounds tore through their early models and wondered if survival was even possible. But by 1945, things had changed. Now, when they saw a Tiger, they didn't panic. They calculated. Where is it facing? What angle do we have? How many? Guns can we put on it? Who has the best shot? They still respected German firepower, but they no longer feared it, because they had learned that even the strongest armor could not stop an attack it never saw coming. And the German crews began to feel it. They noticed how quickly the Americans moved, how often they refused to fight on German terms, how rarely they engaged without support, and how frequently their flanks were compromised just when they thought they had the advantage. It was demoralizing, not because of the firepower, but because of the predictability. The Germans began to realize that the Americans were not reacting to them. They were anticipating them. If you believe that strategy and understanding can be as deadly as steel and fire, leave a comment with your thoughts. And if this kind of forgotten battlefield thinking fascinates you, be sure to subscribe so we can keep digging up the truths that history left behind. It started as a whisper, not in the official reports, not in the radio transmissions, but in the quiet conversations between tank crews as they climbed into their vehicles. Something had shifted. They could feel it in their bones. The fear was not loud. It was subtle. A growing hesitation. A glance exchanged before a mission. A slight delay in starting the engine. It wasn't the fear of death. These men had long made peace with that. It was the fear of something they couldn't explain. Something they didn't understand. The Americans always seemed to be waiting. In the early years of the war, German tank crews had moved with confidence. Their machines were superior. Their tactics were tested, and their enemies were often underprepared. But now, with every passing month, it felt like the Americans were reading their playbook in advance. Tank commanders began to notice familiar patterns. The route that used to be safe suddenly turned deadly. The ridgeline that had always offered a good vantage point was already under surveillance. The village road that looked empty collapsed into a kill zone within minutes of approach. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't just numbers. It was something else. After one failed operation in the Eifel region, a captured German officer admitted to his interrogators that his entire unit had refused to move through a forested area rumored to be patrolled by Shermans, not because of the tanks themselves, but because of what followed them: the artillery, the flanking infantry, the sense that they were being watched before they had even arrived. He called it the Sherman's shadow. Reports like his became increasingly common. At first, High Command dismissed them. Battlefield anxiety, they said. Isolated incidents. But the trend continued. Entire armored companies requested reroutes. Senior officers hesitated to commit tanks without heavy reconnaissance. And when orders finally came, they were laced with a new kind of language. Proceed with extreme caution. Avoid wooded areas. Do not engage. Unless contact is confirmed. This wasn't the language of dominance. It was the language of survival. In a post-war analysis by surviving Wehrmacht strategists, a term appeared that had rarely been used during the height of Germany's armored supremacy: psychological erosion. The enemy was no longer just challenging their strength. He was attacking their confidence. And in tank warfare, confidence is armor. When that cracks, the steel soon follows. One particular battle near the village of Herlesheim exposed the depth of this shift. A unit of German Panthers moved to intercept what was believed to be a small group of American tanks. They had the numbers. They had the high ground. Everything pointed to a swift and decisive victory. But when they advanced, they found nothing. No tanks. No infantry. Just silence. Then, without warning, the lead Panther was hit by a shell from an unseen angle. Seconds later, 2 more were struck. The remaining tanks pulled back. But as they reversed, artillery rained down. Then came the infantry. Then more Shermans. The Germans were driven into retreat without ever seeing the enemy face to face. They weren't defeated in battle. They were dismantled in motion. What made this terrifying wasn't the firepower. It was the orchestration. It felt less like combat and more like choreography. Every move the Germans made was countered before it was even completed. The battlefield was not just occupied, it was owned, and that ownership extended to morale. By 1945, interrogations of captured German tank crews revealed a disturbing consistency. Many no longer believed they could win, not just the war, but individual battles. They spoke of American speed, American coordination, American awareness. Some even believed the Americans had broken their codes. Others whispered of spies in their own ranks. But the truth was more mundane and more devastating. It was logistics, radio, recon, doctrine. The Shermans weren't ghosts. They were gears, machines so vast and well-oiled that it had begun to feel supernatural. Even seasoned crews, men who had survived Kharkov and Kursk, began to second-guess themselves. They double-checked positions, hesitated before giving the order to fire. Some removed identifying markings from their tanks to avoid being singled out by the dreaded fireflies. Others begged for additional infantry escort, even when the odds were in their favor. Veteran German commanders like Hasso von Manteuffel acknowledged in the post-war writings that American adaptability had reached a level of precision rarely seen in military history. He described it as fighting not just an army, but an organism, one that learned, reacted, and never forgot a mistake. This perception, over time, bled into the entire command structure. When a tank crew is afraid, you lose a machine. When a commander is afraid, you lose a battle. But when an entire doctrine begins to fear its opponent, you lose a war. The Sherman didn't have the best armor. It didn't have the best gun. It wasn't the fastest or the quietest, but it had something no German tank could match by 1945. It had confidence, not in itself, but in the system behind it. A Sherman crew knew they would not fight alone, that they would not be forgotten if they were hit, that their movements were part of a plan larger than their viewports, and that trust, that sense of connection, was an invisible shield far stronger than steel. The Germans could see this, and it haunted them. In one chilling account from the Ruhr pocket, a group of surrendering tankers asked their American captors a simple question: how did you always know where we were? The answer, though honest, brought no relief. We didn't, but we knew where you would go. If this story struck you, if it made you reflect on the silent power of psychological warfare, drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're drawn to these deeper truths beneath the metal and fire, subscribe now so we can continue uncovering what most history books leave behind. By the final months of the war, the numbers were no longer just staggering, they were prophetic. The United States had produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks. Germany, barely 1,800 Tigers. Even combined with their Panthers and Panzer IVs, The German armored divisions were outbuilt, outmoved, and outlasted. But the true weight of the Sherman was never just in how many were built. It was in what they represented. The Sherman was not a miracle of design. It was not beautiful nor elegant. It did not dominate by firepower alone. It was a manifestation of something far more terrifying to its enemies. It was proof that America had turned war into a system. A factory in Michigan could build one tank, but a nation built on railroads, oil, and assembly lines could build a storm, and that storm rolled forward relentlessly, not in waves of destruction, but in rhythms of coordination. Every Sherman was a drumbeat, every supply truck a pulse, every radio call a nerve impulse. Together, they formed something far greater than the sum of their steel, and that's what broke the enemy. Germany had believed in the power of genius, of the perfect machine, of the unstoppable ace. The Tiger was a monument to this belief, over-engineered, over-armed, and adored by those who trusted in supremacy through design. But the Tiger needed time, fuel, parts, roads. The Tiger was a statement. The Sherman was an answer. That answer wasn't poetic, it was practical. Sherman could be repaired on the battlefield, towed quickly, cannibalized for parts, modified overnight, painted in the dark. It could be transported by ship, rail, truck, even airlifted when disassembled. It could wade through rivers, climb hills, survive long enough to call for help. And when it died, another one would take its place before the sun came up. One of the most powerful reflections came from a German tank officer after the war, who said, "We were lions, trained to fight with claws and teeth. They brought the forest with them, and the forest devours the lion." That forest was industry, logistics, doctrine, and faith in the idea that war is not won by the strongest weapon, but by the strongest system. By 1945, German tank crews had stopped laughing at the Sherman. They stopped mocking it. Then, they stopped engaging it. Eventually, many just tried to avoid it. Because every Sherman on the field was never alone. It was the tip of a spear that stretched across oceans, through factories, over rail lines, and into the hands of men who had been trained not to win individual glory, but to win the war. And when the final battles were fought, and the final shells fired, the smoke cleared not over the ruins of German cities or fallen tanks. It cleared over silence, a silence built not by the sound of the Sherman's gun, but by the echo of its presence, a presence that could not be outrun, could not be outproduced, could not be unseen. It was never about building the best tank. It was about building the last one. The final truth of the Sherman is not that it was perfect, but that it was enough. Enough to arrive in time, to move as one, and to remind the world that sometimes endurance is the greatest form of dominance. By the time Germany surrendered, the battlefield no longer belonged to the loudest roar or the thickest armor. It belonged to the side that had mastered movement, coordination, response, the side that had turned war into rhythm. And in that rhythm, the Sherman was the beat that never stopped. Thank you for joining us in this journey through history, where behind every bolt of steel lies a lesson in resilience and human will. If this story made you feel something, awe, reflection, maybe even a chill, leave a comment and tell us what stood out most to you. And if you haven't already, subscribe now to support this mission of telling the forgotten stories that shaped our world. Click on the next video appearing now on your screen to keep uncovering the battles that were never about glory, but about grit, sacrifice, and the quiet power of unity. Until next time, remember, the Sherman did not win because it was feared. It won because it endured.